Mexico is the country of inequality. Nowhere does there exist such a fearful difference in the distribution of fortune. The Mexican Indians, when we consider them en masse, offer a picture of extreme misery.
Now, go on, Tavo. Tell us what that was. Why have we heard this before?
Well, that is Alexander von Humboldt, the celebrated Prussian naturalist, in his reflections after visiting the Americas circa 1800.
Now, I say we've heard this before because it feels like over and over across Mexican history, running right into the present, inequality is the refrain for this country. Welcome to Mexico the Podcast, and today we're doing something a little different, which is we're going to cover Mexico and how poor it really is, or isn't, in 5 stats. I'd love to start with one that is really close to home. It's a very recent stat, and it's 30,000 pesos, which is just under $1,500. Now, this is a really interesting number because it's actually 2 stats put together. On one side, it's how much the richest 10% of Mexicans think you need to earn monthly to not be poor. And yet, it is also what the 10% of the poorest Mexicans think that you need to be rich. And so that, just from the beginning, gives you an idea of what we're dealing with when it comes to inequality. Because inequality isn't just about how much money you literally make. It's what you feel you can buy and what it makes you within the sort of like zeitgeist of a country. And it shows how separate Mexicans really are, even when it comes to understanding what poverty means.
We've spoken about the 2 Mexicos that exist, and I think there is no better stat to show that the existence of those 2 Mexicos than what you've just told us.
So yeah, I think that's one to sort of take us out off. But it's just the beginning, right? Like, where does this inequality come from? Is Mexico actually poor? How do we define poverty, right? Like, in my mind, we're going to have 2 conversations over the course of this podcast. The first is whether Mexico is, physically poor, like, as in, like, does it produce a lot or a little? How rich is it in terms of its natural resources? And then, why is there so much poverty in Mexico, given that there are quite a few natural resources, and it does actually produce quite a lot? And so these conversations will go hand in hand throughout this conversation that we're going to have. And that takes us to our second stat, which is 57%. Now, Tavo, 57% meaning what? What are you guessing?
How many people think corn tortillas are better than flour tortillas?
That is far too low. That is far too low. But no, this is taking us way, way back. It takes us to basically the colonial period of Mexico, between the 17th and 18th centuries, and more or less towards the middle of the 18th century, we saw New Spain, which is, at its core was Mexico under the Spanish rule. And it was 57% the amount of silver that was in circulation that was Mexican. So out of the world's entire stock of silver in the 18th century, 57% of it was mined in Mexico. Mexico was enormously productive and enormously rich. It literally financed the entire Spanish Empire for years and years alongside Peru. But especially in the 18th century, Mexico was a titan. And what's interesting to me is it has a lot to do with just global random sort of economic shifts that you can't predict, because this story actually starts in the 16th century when there's a tax reform, nothing sexier than a tax reform, a tax reform in China. The Ming dynasty decides to implement the single whip law, which says you can no longer pay your taxes, Chinese peasant farmer in the 16th century, in rice or in goods. You have to pay it in silver. And then that means there is an enormous boom in the demand for silver. And more or less at this time, you've got the Spanish scratching their heads in the Caribbean and in Mexico, planting pretty valuable crops like sugar, which they've been doing in the Canary Islands. But then suddenly they discover these mines almost exactly at the time when demand shoots up, making it very, very valuable, even more valuable than it would have been anyway, right? Because they could literally pick up all this silver and send it over to China to sell for gold. They call it the bimetallic exchange. And it's basically how they made enormous amounts of money off the backs of, let's say it, indigenous workers. Because this is the key, right? Most colonies fail in the Americas during this period on the basis of how much work and labor they can get into it. In the Caribbean, where they destroyed virtually the entire population, they imported enslaved peoples from Africa. In Mexico, where the population was far greater, they still had this issue, which was about, well, we don't even know, but almost certainly between 50 to 90% of the entire population of the Americas died. And so you've got this conundrum for the Spaniards, who it's, we really, really want to get all this silver out. We can't bring enough people over from Spain. And yet there are still enough people here, scattered across the continent, for us to make a pretty decent labor force. And that's when you get the creation, Tavo, of what is indigenous. The concept of indigeneity, of course, doesn't exist to Native Americans because they are different nations, right? It's like saying all Africans are indigenous or all Europeans are indigenous. Indigenous is a category that is created not just from, ignorance from the Spanish side, but as a deliberate policy of concentration of populations. So they literally pick up populations that are spread across and they concentrate them in cities and towns to better control them, to better evangelize them, and to better extract their labor. Now, these are very, very different people all across the board, but ultimately what they're trying to do is they're trying to force them into a system where they can be productive within the Spanish system.
Right. So before the Spanish arrive, they're not indigenous. They're just people. And these people are, Aztecs, they're Tlaxcaltecs, they're Otomis, there's so many things. But it's very convenient to see beyond these lines and just other them into a working population that we call indigenous. And I think there's this point that you mentioned of the collapse of the population. In Mexico, we talk of maybe up to 90% of the population having been lost, as you said, is extraordinary because it's when you have such colossal loss of life, everything falls apart. So these millenary civilizations that existed, that were extraordinary civilizations, lose all sense of who they were. So it's also a lot easier to other them and just call them indigenous because everything that they were had been lost or was being lost.
Exactly. And it makes them pretty easy to reformulate in a new economic system, because the reason we're talking about this in a history of why Mexico is so unequal and why there's so much historical poverty in Mexico has a lot to do with this collapse of this previous civilization and the introduction of this new one that is almost entirely focused on the extraction of silver in a mercantilist system where people take silver out and they extract labor from the locals. And so their entire civilization is built around that extraction. Now, what's interesting is, over the course of time, you get, of course, administrators coming in and business people, because the crown doesn't really want to invest all this money in the actual extraction of the silver. They want you to just give them the tax once it's come out. And so you start getting the creation of this new aristocracy, sometimes literally and sometimes in terms of this, and sometimes this creation of a new capitalist class, which is people who own the mines, who do the minting, who produce the mercury that you need to extract the silver. A lot of this is under sort of Spanish monopoly, but you need the administrators and the business people. And that's when you start getting this new class in Mexico, the often local people servicing this economy who are actually enormously powerful, even compared to the crown in Spain. You've got these Mexico City business people who basically run the whole show. And what's interesting is they make this money by by becoming the middlemen of this entire economic system. And they're the ones often with the literal whip in hand, extracting the labor from these people. And so we've suddenly got the creation of the archetypes we're going to start seeing throughout this entire story, which is on one side, the upper class, often of European descent, that is extracting wealth to send off to the metropole, and then the often indigenous peoples who are doing all the work and extracting all those goods from the ground. So we basically get 5 centuries of this. And what's interesting is this doesn't really change with independence. We have the same, they call it caste system, that is instigated from the Spanish era and comes into the era of modern Mexico right up to the Porfiriato. Now, what is the Porfiriato? Well, I'll tell you in stat number 3, which is 10 years, which is how long it took for Mexico's economy to get back to where it was after the Mexican Revolution. Now, I've skipped a bit there, but I think it's important. The Mexican Revolution happens in 1910 as a reaction to the Porfiriato, which is the rule of Porfirio Diaz, the man who ruled Mexico for 30 years and is often credited for being the man who brought Mexico into modernity and really, really grew its economy. But what I kind of love about this is that I'd like to contradict that. I think the Porfiriato, in economic terms, was an utter failure.
And just to make sure our listeners are with us, we've jumped quite a bit of time, right? We were talking about the Spanish, we're talking about the caste system that comes from Spain, but somewhere in between here, there is the Mexican independence. There's a whole, pretty much, it was half a century of war with everyone. But then we make it to Porfirio Diaz. And Porfirio Diaz is important because he is traditionally associated with an era of stability, of bringing stability and modernity to Mexico.
Exactly. But of course, I think it's an ill-gotten stability because it's stability built entirely on a sort of extreme version of this inequality because we've suddenly got industrial capitalism coming into the scene, incredibly productive. So you see the explosion of the Mexican economy of the likes Mexico hadn't seen since it became independent. And you see the creation of these new industrial classes, both workers in factories, but also capitalists in the sort of sense that we understand them, right? The industrial capitalists with textile factories, with modern mining, with the hacienda system, which is, people often think of the hacienda system as feudal, which is these massive ranches around a single massive building that produced a lot of things, from pulque, this alcoholic drink that we talked about that comes from this cactus, to maize, to silk and different agricultural goods that then got produced within the hacienda into textiles or fermented beverages or whatever. As opposed to what many people often think, this was actually a really industrialized process. And we got basically a new aristocracy, these new Porfirian bigwigs who are able to take over Mexican society with the power of their money, with the power of their influence, and really hold down everyone else under their foot.
And I think something that's really important about the hacienda system, which very much dominates Mexico in this time, is people often talk about it as plantations. And when you first look at them, you could think that they look a lot like plantations. But as you say, Alex, there's a key difference where here you have the whole value chain, or a whole chunk of the value chain, fully integrated. If you go to the peninsula, the Yucatan Peninsula, you can see today these haciendas, but you had these massive plantations, yes, but then you would have had the factory, that the downstream, essentially turning these agricultural goods into other types of woods, like, for example, rope. And then the railway system in Mexico was designed so that you could just ship things directly out. So the railway would take you from the hacienda, from the factory and plantation, directly to the port and out into the markets.
Exactly.
So these were very, very sophisticated sort of industrial or proto-industrial facilities.
Exactly right. But what happens when you get modern industry combined with this semi-feudal peon system inherited from the sort of Spanish system? You get terrible, terrible exploitation. Basically, the entire Porfirian regime was built on a political level to repress any sort of dissent. The agreement was, you get no political rights if you're middle class and upwards. You just have to support the Porfiriato, and in exchange you get easy money and growth. And then you help us, the rich, help the government, hold down everyone else so that we can extract their labor for as cheaply as possible. Now, this might sound a lot like what happens nowadays across the developing world, right? Cheapness of labor tends to be what makes their goods valuable on the world stage. But what we saw under the Porfiriato was far, far worse and far more extreme. No human rights, no working rights. And that's why the few labor unions that were created, the few strikes that did occur, were brutally put down. And then that pressure pot just gathered and gathered in steam until in 1910, the revolution explodes. And for 10 years, we get economic devastation, but also fascinating economic experiments.
Now, let me just go back a little bit. So, what you're describing about, horrible or inexistent rights of workers, that sounds a lot like what was happening in Europe. Would you say the case in Mexico was the same, just Mexico exploded before, or was it actually worse?
It was different because, again, right, it's really important to consider the caste system. Usually when you look at Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you get a different sort of class system. Whereas in Mexico, because it was so racialized and because it was so exploitative, you got these systems. I'd say it was the class system on steroids. And you can really see that from the massive inequality, right? Porfirio Diaz is often given the credit for creating the Mexican middle class. But the Mexican middle class back in 1910 was at its largest at under 10% of the population. Everyone else virtually was completely poor and exploited. And so that's what creates this Mexican Revolution on the basis of, for the rich, it's for sure political representation, but for the poor, from people like Pancho Villa in the north, a big revolutionary name, and in the south, Emiliano Zapata, it's all about owning your land and being able to own your labor and what you produce, which is actually far more capitalist in its vision than the exploitative semi-feudal system we had under Porfirio Diaz, where your labor was extracted and you were sort of basically given enough to survive, but not to produce anything more and not to own anything.
Right. So in that sense, Europe had, at this point has gotten rid of serfdom, for example. Mexico still has a version of that. Europe has a growing bourgeoisie. Mexico has a very small bourgeoisie.
Exactly. So we have the revolution, 1910, and there is just all-out war, especially between 1913 and 1914. Now, we're going to avoid all the sort of the warring and the politics. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty for that. We're going to look at the economy and what happened there, because the experiments, I think, are so interesting. To start with, the devastation changes the economy and how you do business. To start with, the rail is completely destroyed. That's the symbol of this progress, but it's also the symbol of exploitation, right? And what's interesting, I almost thought this would be the fact, the stat that I brought up, but the number of mules and donkeys during that age doubled, which I think is sort of wonderful because it shows people managing, but it also shows I wouldn't say people reverting back to the past, but people adapting their economic circumstances. And the reason people didn't go back to the past is because they actually leapt to the future, I think. This is what's interesting about the Mexican Revolution. You get these little pockets of resistance where you get massive social and economic reforms that completely change the way people understand how you can do business and how the economy should be worked in Mexico. Specifically, I think Villa and Zapata in the north and the south are really good examples because they're the sort of like pop cultural heroes. Villa, of course, is known as a big bandit. And so the folktales would have us assume that Villa was basically cattle rustling and gutting haciendas to sell for gold and food. And what's interesting is there was an export boom from Chihuahua during that age of the revolution, but it wasn't because they were gutting haciendas. They were taking them away from the rich, but they were taking them into control of the state, which I think is incredibly modern for that age, right? It's basically this new social, maybe dare I say socialist vision of what the state could do. So they redistributed some land. The state controlled, we'll call it the industrial parts of the hacienda, but everyone else got to sell. They got to own the land and sell into the hacienda system. So you get workers' rights, you get people owning land and their labor suddenly, but you also get very, very strict laws. No one can drink. No one is allowed to sort of work outside of this sort of military economic system, which makes sense, right? In the middle of a war, but it also feels very close to this sort of like Stalinism we'd see many decades later. And what's interesting here is the difference between Villa in the north, sort of doing this redistribution via the state, which is the state controls everything, versus what happens in the south, where Zapata was far more liberal, socialist even, in his redistribution of land for the peasants. In fact, the Zapatista movement today is very much based on land and ownership, right? And that's what Zapata did at this point. And there was an economic boom at the time, but it was terrible for the rest of the country because the redistribution of land stopped a lot of what was exported out of the state of Morelos, where Zapata was based. And so while people were, doing fine in Morelos, literally a couple of miles north in Mexico City, there were massive famines because the corn being produced around there was simply not going out. But we've got all these experiments that would completely define how Mexicans see their economy. We've got the inequality, sure, but we've also got these new experiments that would sort of be expressed throughout the rest of Mexican history up until this very day, which is who should own land, how should workers organize, who ultimately gets to profit the most from work. And you see a lot of these failed experiments, both what we can call on the left and the right? You can see the failure of the Zapata system, where only a few, working rural people get to eat, and then the urban people don't get to eat. You get this sort of authoritarian vision in Villa, and then you also get, the rich people's vision, which is, well, let's just keep all the money coming to the rich. And so we've got this massive political debate going on in what is the world's first social revolution of the 20th century. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, before the Cuban, before the Chinese, was the Mexican, bringing these debates to the fore. And that brings us to our fourth stat, which is 4.6%. But I'm not even going to tell you what that's about, Tavo, because to me, what's important, what's interesting is how it links to this revolution, which is back in the early 20th century, in the 1910s, a young chap called Mr. Salim decided that he didn't want to be a conscript in the Ottoman army. And so he moved to Mexico and found that in the midst of economic devastation, a lot of the assets were incredibly cheap. And so he bought them up. And Mr. Salim, who called himself Slim by that time, became a relatively wealthy man in Mexico. His son...
Now, where have we heard this Slim name before?
I know, there's slim pickings for that particular name in Mexico, but I'll give you another clue. His son Carlos Slim, built on that wealth and on that strategy. 4.6% today is Carlos Slim's worth as a percentage of the entire Mexican economy. So we've got this story of enormous inequality stretching from the revolution to the present day through this very interesting and perfectly legitimate business strategy, which is the buying up of troubled assets over the course of Mexican history to consolidate them, to make them profitable, but not necessarily to produce goods in a way that is, we'll say, equitable across the economy, an extractivist vision of the economy.
That is a fascinating figure, a terrifying figure as well, and one with an enormous amount of irony, because there's a story that dates back to the years right before the revolution, where supposedly a man was asked whether he came from the state of Chihuahua, to which he laughed and said, "No, sir, I am not from Chihuahua. Chihuahua is mine." Chihuahua is a state that's roughly half the size of Spain. Okay, it's a colossal state, and a single man owned it. The fact that a revolution that was trying to do away with such a level of inequality would then create the circumstances that a certain family would build on to become 4.6% of a G20 is extraordinary.
Now, I would say that there's a lot of space between the revolution and Carlos Slim today, right? But I would point out one specific thing, which is, while it's completely legitimate, in my view, for a person or a company to buy struggling assets or to buy any sort of asset and incorporate them, roll them up into one company, there is an issue with the way Carlos Slim did it. On the sort of positive, nice and cushy side, Carlos Slim represents a sort of interesting form of Mexican patriotism, which is he bets on the economy when it's down and out. When there is a crisis is when Carlos Slim does best, because he bets on Mexican goods. His view is consistently Mexican goods, for whatever reason, are often undervalued. Like a US insurance company that does virtually the same thing and provides the same services in Mexico is often valued at a higher rate than an equivalent Mexican company. Now, for whatever reason, people think that and people value that and people price that in. Carlos Slim says, no, I'm a Mexican patriot. I think that these assets are worth more. And so he buys them up. Now, this is pretty much the story of the Slims until 1982. And I think this is where we diverge from the sort of touchy-feely version of Carlos Slim, because we get the creation of Slim's main crown jewel, which is Telmex. And it's the Mexican telephone company that was privatized after the government decided that it couldn't afford and it didn't want to keep all these companies under its belt. What's interesting is, what was crucial for Slim at that time was his closeness to the Mexican political elite. And so we feel like we're back in the colonial ages again, right? Like you've got the distant political elite, the local economic elite, doing deals not for what's best for the country or the people, but what's best for the bottom line for a person like Slim. Now, they always justify this in economic terms, but you can see from the moment that Slim buys this company, he makes it into this empire, he becomes the richest man on earth in 2012 on the basis of extorting people for telecoms goods, some of the most expensive for people to buy in a country that isn't particularly rich. And so you see, again, what used to be silver and people would give their labor. Now you've got people giving their hard-earned wages to extremely expensive telecom services with no actual quality behind them, right? With no competition either.
The tricky thing about Slim is, as you say, he's a Mexican patriot, and he's bet on the country over and over again when others have fled, including many of the Mexican aristocrats. So on the one hand, yes, the quality of telephone service that Mexicans had access to in 2012 was deplorable, particularly when you looked at how expensive it was. But on the other hand, when you look at the telephone service that Mexicans had before Slim buys it out in the early 90s, that was much, much, much worse. You were paying for the telephone service and you wouldn't get telephone service for weeks. And when you when you went to the office and demanded that they fix it, they'd be like, sure, we'll fix it in 2 months. So yes, he's become enormously rich off of this. And I think it's a bit too much when you become the richest man in the world doing this. But on the other hand, he's been willing to bet on something that really no one else wanted to bet on.
I think you've hit the nail on the head here. It takes us back to, I think, our second episode where we talked about whether or not the Mexican government or any government should be involved in the economy. And I think our conclusion then, as is our conclusion now, is the issue tends to be not whether it's private or public, but whether it's a monopoly, whether anyone has any choice to escape from the clutches of one particular company in what is an essential service. I mean, I think Mexico already considers internet access a human right. So what happens when that human right, quote unquote, whether you believe that or not, is under the thumb of a single monopoly? I think that's the biggest issue on the economic side. But on the political side, I think it's just as important to mention that Slim was able to get there because of his influences. It's not an accident that a very rich man became even richer in a moment when the government said that it wanted to privatize Telmex in a sort of more equitable way where everyone could buy stock. And yet very few people bought stock. Slim got all the stock. And so I don't want to get into this too much because I think the very first article written in the Mexico Political Economist, which you should buy a subscription to read this for, the very first article is about Carlos Slim and how he very deftly navigates political waters. We're always talking about how good he is as a businessman. We're never talking enough about how clever he is when it comes to politics. So I think we can leave Slim there. I don't think we're in a position to make any moral judgments about him. I think Why Nations Fail, the Nobel Prize-winning authors behind it, have already more or less said what they think about that. And Carlos Slim, by the way, thinks they're full of it. But I think it's sort of funny because in the press conference where he said, "Oh, the authors of Why Nations Fail have no idea what they're talking about. They say that I extracted wealth and didn't give anything back, but they're idiots." And then seconds later, in that same conference, he said, "Well, I own all the telecoms infrastructure, so Netflix and Spotify should pay me more to provide services. And of course, you, my dear listener living in Mexico, would pay more for the exact same service because Carlos Slim gets an extra cut from the platform services."
The things you can get away with when you own all the telephone infrastructure.
But he did build it, right? As you said, right? It is definitely better than it was in 1982. Is it better than the equivalent markets where people pay this amount? Who knows, right? That's the eternal debate.
So now, coming on to our last point. I see here, Alex, that you talk about a 7-point fall. What are you referring to here?
7.4 sounds bad, right? Something bad's happening here. It's the amount that the Mexican economy's dependence on exports fell as a percentage of the entire economy. What do I mean by that? It's basically about 6 years ago, more or less, 43% of Mexico's GDP depended on exports. Today, it's 36%. That's the fall. That's the 7-point fall. Before we were more dependent on exports, now we're less dependent on exports. My hot take is that this is actually the symptom of good news for two reasons. Obviously, we've seen what's happened with the United States. We've seen the tariff debate, all that. The fact that we're so dependent on exports to the United States, which is where over 80% of Mexico's exports go, I think is an important thing to start to reconsider. If we're not going to diversify our exports, maybe there's a new way of doing things. And that's what this current and the previous government have more or less tried to do, which is to make Mexican growth be based on domestic consumption, which means you need people to be rich enough to grow the economy, which is actually a relatively revolutionary approach. Very capitalist. They're not saying let's go socialist. They're saying, what if the Mexican economy grew on the basis of its own consumption instead of exporting relatively low value added products abroad?
Now, this sounds a lot like the import substitutions that we've spoken about before, and the kind of policy that's been used not only in Mexico, but across the Americas and South Korea. Is this sort of the 21st version of that, or is it something completely different?
It is a 21st century version of that. So you've got, of course, the Plan Mexico, which we mentioned in our state intervention episode, which is Claudia Sheinbaum's, as you say, import substitution plan for strategic industries. They go from auto industry to the energy industry to the semiconductor industry to the food and beverage industry. All these industries are going to get some sort of government backing or some sort of government competition. Funnily enough, it depends on where you stand politically within the constellation of power in this new age of we'll call it left-wing government under Morena. If you are the chip industry, you're going to get money, and you're going to get support, and you're going to get infrastructure. If you're the telecoms industry, you're going to get a competitor. You're going to get a government-backed competition that's going to come in and compete with you to bring prices down. Now, that's probably a whole different episode. It's going to be very interesting to see how it pans out, but it moves us away from what I think is a big issue and a big debate that we've had over the past half a century, basically, which is the previous vision for Mexican growth, which was export-oriented. I don't think that's bad at all. I think very few people think that's bad. Both the current government and previous governments want Mexico to continue to export. What they want to change is why and how we export. As we discussed, low wages tend to be what make Mexico competitive, especially in North America, where we export most of our goods. But it also means that very little money stays here, and so you've got lots of workers being paid very little and with very little incentive for that wage to go up. So what do? Well, we've got this new plan.
I mean, that all sounds very good, but the big question for me is how are they going to ensure that in the creation of all these new industries, they don't just create a brand new aristocratic class, another slim or a bunch of other slims. It is a large economy. There is enough to go around to make a bunch of billionaires without necessarily ultimately improving the conditions of the average person.
You've hit the nail on the head. One of the more interesting, controversial articles that we published in the Mexico Political Economist was a look inside the politics of the ruling party, Morena. And we've already got an aristocracy there. Right? We've already got basically a reproduction of this new elite, but it's nonetheless an elite where titles are inherited and people don't really get a chance at the bat. So if that's happened in the party already, there's absolutely no reason why there wouldn't be a new oligarchy created in Mexico to replace Slim. But I think Slim is so clever he won't be replaced. I think he's done a very good job at getting close to this government. So I think you're right. I think there is an interesting movement towards reducing inequality, to spreading wealth, and it seems to have worked to a certain extent. Mexican growth is more or less sustained to a much greater degree by internal consumption. But whether or not that creates wealth that stays in Mexico is very much a question we're still asking ourselves.
Well, there were 26 million Mexicans in 2022 living under the poverty line, according to the World Bank definition of that. So let's hope, for their sake, that this policy pans out. I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we'll be taking you through Mexico's history, economy, politics.
And why you, wherever you are in the world, are deeply affected by it every single day.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. And don't forget, Mexico Political Economist, subscribe now.